Hello and welcome to Series 3 of the Borne Podcast, the podcast that brings you stories of research, resilience and real-life experiences of pregnancy and preterm birth. I'm Ellie Gibson.
And I'm Caro Tasker.
And I'm Mark Johnson. As an obstetrician, I've seen the devastating effects of preterm birth, how challenging it can be for families who are going through that, and the extraordinary strength shown by parents. And I believe, because I'm a scientist, in the progress that can be made through research. And it is that belief that led me to found Borne in 2013, to better understand pregnancy, to find ways to prevent preterm birth before it begins.
At Borne, our aim is to prevent preterm birth, giving every baby the best possible start in life. We fund pioneering research to deepen our understanding of pregnancy and childbirth, research that brings us closer to answers and realising our aim to prevent preterm birth.
In this podcast, we bring together parents, experts and scientists to share their stories with honesty and compassion. We talk about the science, but we also talk about hope, heartbreak, courage and the small victories that mean everything. Because every insight, every conversation and every breakthrough moves us towards a future where more babies can arrive safely at the right time.
Today, we are joined by Natasha Singh. Natasha is a consultant obstetrician at Chelsea and Westminster and Honorary Senior Lecturer at Imperial College London. We are also joined by Lucy Reynolds, who herself has used the Preterm birth debrief service that, hopefully, Natasha, you are going to explain exactly what that is for us today, because it sounds incredible. Could you give us some more information on that?
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for having us both here today. We are delighted. So the Preterm birth debrief service, basically, as the name says, is a service we've set up for women who have experienced preterm birth, so that they can come and actually speak to us about their experience, what that meant to them, and also give them an opportunity to get some answers from us in terms of why this has happened. So this actually service was set up based on feedback I had from some patients who actually had experienced preterm birth. Being a consultant in an NHS hospital, at the time I was the service director. And of course, when you in that role, you get feedback from service users. So this feedback had come in to us, and it was a couple who had experienced preterm birth, very extreme. The baby was admitted to the neonatal unit, but that baby sadly passed away. They did receive services, bereavement services from the NHS, but maternity services, we didn't respond in terms of giving them an answer as to why their child was born preterm and while they subsequently went on to lose their baby. So they were quite surprised that they went home with no answers. And I must say, so we arranged to meet with them, and it was probably one of, for me, the most insightful discussions I've had with parents who had experienced a preterm loss. And as a clinician over the years, you see people coming in, you speak to them, you treat them, you may not see these people again. And actually, it made me reflect on my own practice, but equally so the gap that we have within the service, in that people needed answers. They needed to know why the baby was born too soon, why that happened to them, why them. The woman said, why did my body suddenly give up? I'm healthy, I'm otherwise well. And just going through their history, we were able to give them some information as to why, to try to understand what had happened. We know 85% of people have no risk factors, that's what we're told, but actually listening to this couple, there were certain risk factors, that subtle risk factors, that actually there were signs that this was going to happen. So I think it taught me to want to listen.
I think, having been through these challenges myself, it's about preventing it happening again, because it's your greatest fear. And if you don't have that knowledge, you have no way of preventing it. How does someone access that service? How do we, from the beginning, how do I recommend it to a friend? How do I say, this is an incredible service, this is what you need to do? How would someone proceed to that?
So at the moment, Borne had thankfully funded the service because we realised there was a need. So for the initial part, when we had set the service up, there was no administrative support. So my colleague and I would go to the ward and invite anybody who's given preterm birth an invitation to come to join us as an appointment. Following that, it's now embedded as part of the NHS service. So if you've given birth preterm at our hospital, you are referred directly into the clinic.
That's given me goose pimples. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's all now embedded.
This is incredible.
So, and now we're seeing probably about 2 women a week that come through the service. So since we started the service in around 2019, we've had 250 women approximately through the service. And as you said, what does it look like? So they get an appointment. I have a brilliant PA who organizes the appointment, and some of them send through the questions that they may have for us. So they will sort of send an email around the things they want to discuss. We would have probably some blood test results. We'll go through the notes. So there's a bit of prepping before. I've got a really good research midwife who works with me, and she would help me sort of go through the notes. We go through, try to understand from the notes perspective what caused the preterm birth. And then we meet with the couple. Going through notes is important because not everybody takes home a live child. Some people do leave without a child, or some people have had a child that's still in the neonatal unit, or some have had a child that has ongoing problems. Some are lucky in that they take home a child that's actually fine with no problems. So we sort of have an idea of, we sort of anticipate how they are going to come into that consultation. You know, they may be stressed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where
this
are
is
they
imperative.
in the journey? Exactly.
Absolutely imperative.
So have some idea. So we meet, and then we sort of have the clinic in a area that it's not the usual antenatal clinic where they see other pregnant women. It's not the usual antenatal
You are
space.
not queuing up with heavily pregnant
women.
other people.
Yes.
You are not surrounded by teeny tiny babies. You are not any of those things. It's a practice.
Yes.
It's a medical practice, but it is neutral and it is comfortable.
That's the word.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that is absolutely wonderful. That's an incredible space to be able to have.
And a
isn't
safe
it?
space. A safe space that, as you say, is very neutral and safe. And what we do is we sort of go through the early pregnancy journey, sometimes pre-pregnancy, early pregnancy, and we go through sort of, you know, if they've had any bleeding or pain that may have gone unnoticed, where did they spend most of the early pregnancy? And there's some themes that later on I'll tell you that have come out of where people spend most of the early pregnancy, you know, back and forth to accident and emergency with bleeding, or they've had pain, or they've called maternity services with pain and they've been told it's all normal, it's natural, it's okay. So they've been reassured with these symptoms. And then we go through potentially if they've had any risk factors that we could sort of modify in the future. And then we talk about events that lead up to the admission where they were in preterm labour, and then go through their care on the ward, and then go through sort of the events around the birth, and then the postnatal care. And then we sort of put that together, hearing it from the parents and hearing it from the woman. It's always slightly different to what's in the notes. There are lots of gaps that they fill, and that knowledge gap, I think, has been so eye-opening and so insightful for me as a clinician, and also for research purposes, because a lot of our preterm birth research has always been, we're looking at tissue types, and, you know, we're looking at preterm birth in a preterm birth clinic. We were very molecular with a lot of our research, which is right, because we need to understand mechanism. Speaking to these people have allowed me to shift my focus and attention to that early part of their pathway. You know, how could we make it better in that early part of the pregnancy to change pathways that could actually help us to understand from a research perspective what goes on in that early part of the pregnancy. You know, the people who have recurrent bleeding or pain, you know, what goes on there that actually then, you know, by that time they present, it's too late because their cervix is open and they are dilated, and it's too late by the time they come. So how could we shift forward our prediction rather than try to predict when they present on the ward? Because by then it's as a clinician, there isn't much we can do.
No.
At that point in time.
And I think for you in your position as a clinician to be able to say, we don't know and there's nothing we can do, is extraordinarily challenging. You know, that's a really hard thing for you and your colleagues to do. And it's not, I mean, obviously it's a service and it's a phenomenal service, but it's also an incredible source of research. You know, when we're talking Venn diagrams, what's happened to this family, this family, this family, this family. And you're saying that you've seen patterns. You're spotting patterns.
Yes.
And what does that look like?
When I did my research degree with Professor Mark Johnson, who is Borne-funded, he was my supervisor. My research was geared towards understanding the different phenotypes associated with preterm labour. Because preterm labour or birth, sometimes people group everybody together in one. But we know now that preterm labour is not one unique entity, but there are many presentations or phenotypes, such as infection or stretch, or there are different phenotypes for preterm labour. When I did that, I recruited women in who presented differently with different phenotypes in preterm labour, and I studied their uterus, I studied the placenta, etc. And that gave us some idea in terms of what was happening at a tissue level. What I didn't study was what led to this very, very early in the pregnancy. Looking back now at these women, of course, they're a different cohort of women, but looking back early in the journey, women present actually with a lot of early pregnancy bleeding. And a lot of them bleed going into this early second trimester. So we've identified a cohort of women with early pregnancy bleeding who are at higher risk of preterm labour. And when they go into preterm labour, they present differently to women who don't bleed. So what we want to direct our research is to try to understand, why do these women bleed early in pregnancy, and why do they then go on to give birth preterm? And how are they different to people who don't bleed? And what can we do differently to help these women have a better pregnancy experience via research? Because if you are less than 13 weeks, you are cared for by early pregnancy services. But there is a gap between 13 weeks and 20 weeks where people, if they have problems, where do they go? Do they go to accident and emergency? Do they go to maternity services? So a lot of these, some of the themes arising was that these people were saying that they were having their care in accident and emergency. They didn't belong to anyone.
You know, who is available. And
exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. That's really interesting. You were actually just saying as well that hearing those experiences and the journeys of the people directly from them was very, very different to the notes. I know you can't go into, we know that the notes have to be scientific and helpful to the people reading them. But when you say you were struck by the difference, what do you mean by that?
It's the lived experience. I mean, these women are like a living library. We've got a collection. It's like a living library of lived experiences, and it's joining loops. So when we see someone in the hospital as an emergency, there is not the time to go back and say, okay, what happened when you were 12, 13 weeks? So joining the dots wasn't there. So the notes wouldn't reflect. Maternity services wouldn't link the fact this woman had presented 3 times to accident and emergency with vaginal bleeding or pain, and link it all to, oh, you know what? This woman is probably high risk for preterm birth. Because people are not switched on in terms of thinking about preterm birth every day. So abdominal pain, bleeding, okay, you come to hospital, people will check your cervix, they will do basic tests, admit you to the ward. But I think we need to raise a bit more awareness that if people present in this way, their main risk is going into preterm labor. What can we do differently to identify these women very early in their care so that their pathway is different, so that they are not seen as somebody who's low risk, but they are seen as a high-risk pregnancy because they've had recurrent bleeding that we know, and there is enough in the literature that makes that association between early pregnancy bleeding, recurrent bleeding, and preterm birth. But yet we don't have pathways established for these women to be seen regularly, to have that input, medical input when it's needed, and that assurance that actually their pregnancy is carrying on normal. But if we were to have a dedicated pathway for these women, we could potentially recognize at some point in time their cervix is shortening, or there is something where we could actually intervene earlier rather than when they do present, there is nothing much we can do at that point in time because it's too late.
And how do we do that? How do we get that? How do we manage that pathway? What's the next? If you were gifted that right now, I could say to you, well, what do you need? What do you need?
I would need to just set up a clinic for people after they're 13 weeks pregnant, if they've had 2 or more episodes of bleeding, to come to see us in a prevention clinic where we could take their history, do that assessment, do a cervical length, and follow them up through. Some people need progesterone treatment. We know some of the early studies have shown that vaginal progesterone can reduce the risk of miscarriage in this cohort of women, ensure that they have that continuity of care, that consistency of information. And I'm not saying that it may make a big difference, but it may make a difference to baby being born at 23 weeks versus 28 weeks.
That's massive. That's quite a leap to 28 weeks. That's a proper landmark in terms of gestational age. And we know that every day matters, but every week matters at that stage, doesn't it? On the grounds of development, of the grounds of, well, everything about the fetus. And so I'm being put in contact with you because I have ticked all of those boxes and I've come in to see you. Are you then, how often do you see your patients and within this service that we're talking about today?
It's a one appointment which lasts for about 1 hour. Mm-hmm. And at the end of that appointment, we give some answers as to why the woman has experienced preterm birth. And usually it's early pregnancy bleeding mediated, and we call it vascular, or we think there's overstretching of the uterus, or we think it was infection that drove that preterm birth. Sometimes we don't have a reason because that's the nature of preterm birth. You can't. But we also address other things. We address the psychological aspects of it, because a lot of people come into there with a lot of guilt, thinking that there is something they've done, there's something they had to eat, there was a trip that they just took, and they come in there with a lot of guilt. So the first thing is to address those. Are these the reasons why? Was it the trip we took to the US? Was it a long haul flight?
Was it the piece of cheese?
Was it the piece of cheese?
Honestly, you go right down to the wire. You really, really do. Hang on a minute. I think I might have inhaled alcohol through someone's. Honestly, you literally take every teeny tiny bit. That's extraordinary. And the mentality of it is very important. I've discussed this with Mark Johnson at length. And so you are then able to go right here, right now.
Yes.
I can tell you that.
Exactly. And the way it lifts off their shoulders is amazing. It's to just go, it really lifts off their shoulders, because they feel so guilty that something they've done to cause that. By the time we get to that point in the consultation, we've gone through the history, they understand a bit better, they understand why, and then we make a plan for the future. For some people, it's a bit too soon to make that plan for the future, so I would then see them back again, probably in, when they feel ready to come back for another visit. And, we offer them a follow-up visit if they want to. Some people, we put them in touch with the maternity trauma loss team or psychologists if they need that, because some people are still healing through that process, or we put them in touch with the bereavement team. And then next pregnancy, we ask them if they are planning a pregnancy to contact us. And most of them do contact us. We have followed up those women in subsequent pregnancies. 90% of them have gone on to have a full-term pregnancy and have a good outcome. And that's amazing.
That's amazing.
That's not, I don't think that's a result of the service, but what we want to do is to make sure people never experience what those people have experienced. So those 250 women that we've seen, we want that to go down to zero, because we don't want people to experience what those women have experienced, because it's not nice. And the thing that they always ask us is about the child, because of course sometimes we have a post-mortem report and we have a placenta that goes to the lab and analyze that placenta. We call histology report. And these children are healthy. There is nothing wrong with these children. So they are healthy children. If we were able to predict properly and have treatment that would have prolonged these pregnancies, they would have been absolutely fine. And that's a bit that the takeaway, I guess, some hope to know that it wasn't an abnormality in the child. It wasn't a problem with them, but it's just the fact that, we have to move faster with our research, faster with the way as clinicians, we have to design pathways to support these women, because it's a gap. It's a gap in knowledge, it's a gap in service, and it is a gap in research.
So moving over to you, Lucy. Now, you've used this service. Would you mind giving us a little bit of backstory, whatever you're comfortable saying, and how the service has impacted you?
It's really amazing listening to the service, and I have been lost completely without it, to be honest. So very grateful for the service and what you're doing for all those other women as well. So our story goes back to late 2020. I was admitted to hospital in my first pregnancy just before Christmas. I had been deemed low risk pregnancy. It was through COVID, and so my midwife appointments had been few and far between. And I was admitted with some symptoms I was a bit worried about. Went in that 5 days before Christmas, I think, and I was told, fine, you're dilating, you're probably going to give birth this evening. And I think I was just shy of 24 weeks at that point. I'd gone in with these symptoms I was slightly concerned about, and then that was thrown on me, and it was kind of like, wow, okay. So I had 2 weeks in hospital actually before our first little boy Ozzy was born. It was a skeleton staff over Christmas. I was seen by a different consultant every day who told me a different story about what they thought was going on, whether they thought I was going to carry this baby much further, whether I was going to make it to term, what was going to happen to my baby. Different story every day. And you can imagine there's complete emotional turmoil, completely traumatic. Yeah, not good at all. Anyway, I gave birth to Ozzy just shy of 26 weeks. And he was on NICU for 3 weeks, a little warrior. He did amazingly well, and then tragically got necrotizing enterocolitis, which is very common in premature babies. And I had the call about 6-7 o'clock that morning to say he appeared very unwell. They were doing all the tests. We were there within 20 minutes, and tragically he died at 3 o'clock that afternoon. So, I left that hospital. This wasn't Chelsea. This was back at my local hospital in the Midlands, completely confused. I had no idea why I'd had these complications, why I'd gone into preterm labour, why Ozzy had come so soon, why he'd done amazingly well on NICU, and then why he got necrotizing enterocolitis, just a whole world of questions and unanswered questions. I was offered a neonatal debrief, so I saw the neonatal consultants sort of probably 6 weeks post Ozzy's death, but nothing in terms of kind of my obstetric care or what had happened, what might have gone wrong. And everything you've alluded to there is kind of me. I had 2 bleeds in Ozzy's pregnancy in the first trimester, which, I went for scans, there was a heartbeat, and I was like, great, everything's fine. There was never any link to whether that should have made me high risk, should I have had further monitoring or anything. There was nothing. My mum was on a socially distanced walk with a friend post Ozzy's death and was put in touch with Caro's Instagram, who said she was involved with a preterm birth charity. So I instantly was kind of looking at that, booked an appointment with Professor Mark Johnson, came down to talk to him, and he put me in touch with Natasha's birth debrief service funded by Borne. So I got my notes from the local hospital. We went through it all, got some answers at last about what potentially went wrong. And I think, the biggest thing for me, the guilt was massive. What did I do wrong? Why could my body not hold my baby? And also the kind of all I ever wanted in life was to be a mummy. And now I'm like, am I not going to be able to have a baby? My baby's died. What's going to happen in future pregnancies? Is the same thing going to happen again and again and again? And so I think the big thing for me with the debrief was planning for future pregnancies. And we had a plan. It worked. I had my second little boy in February 2022. I'm now pregnant with my 3rd baby, all under the care of Natasha. So I think without that debrief, I don't know where I'd be today, to be honest.
First and foremost, I'm so, so sorry. It's an incredibly difficult, and I think when you become a parent to a child that you can't bring home, you close a door. And we've spoken a lot about this, actually. I'm great friends with 2 other women who also have different journeys to their baby loss than the one you had and the one I have. And we talk a lot about, you close the door and then there's like this weird window, which is like the windows you see in a toilet, which you can't see through. And the old you is behind that. And actually that's gone now. And people use the phrase, well, if you know, it's overused. But you really, really cannot sit in these shoes because you actually really wouldn't want anyone else to anyway. Absolutely. And nobody wants to be part of this group. But we are part of this group. And I think what Natasha's service is doing is actually, it's beyond science, and we do not talk enough about the maternal health, mental health, and the whole picture, because it is all involved, and it can affect the science, and it can affect the baby, and it can affect future pregnancies, and the direct impact of that is extraordinary. And where we have it better now is that we are more vocal about it. We have people like Natasha, and we have people like Mark Johnson, and we have Borne, and we have, where we all hate social media, where socials are great, is that my little Freddie has found you this service, and that makes me feel really, really amazing, because equally, where there's so much crossover, when I'm hearing you talk about how your body this, and we feel the guilt, and the female feels the guilt. You know, Freddie was a healthy little boy. He just wasn't big enough, and he hadn't grown enough. And all I thought was, well, my entire body has failed me, you know. So it's a very interesting, I mean, thank you so much for sharing that with us. That's absolutely phenomenal. Are you feeling well today? How are things going with your pregnancy, if that's okay to ask?
Yeah, no, I think just going back to what you were saying about kind of the gaps in the notes, you know, you see all the clinical notes of, you know, because I got my notes from local hospital for you to have a look through, and actually seemingly looking through it, you know, there was nothing more they could have done. There was nothing more that, you know, they did what they should have done by the book, you know, and medical legally, there was nothing that they'd done wrong or anything like that. But the way they made me feel emotionally was awful. And I think that's a huge gap in the notes. So, you know, I still, however many years later, have notes on my phone with a complaint. And I'm like, you know, maybe one day I will have the headspace to be able to do it. But it just always comes back to the thought that if they were to look through my notes, there's nothing there that anybody did wrong. It was just an unfortunate set of events. But actually the way they made me feel through all of that was hideous. And it, you know, that link with
depersonalisation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. There's depersonalisation, dehumanisation, absolutely.
And I think so, you know, huge links with PTSD, postnatal depression following the loss of, you know, your baby. And I think the debrief service really helped pull me back from that.
That's important now.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in terms of kind of going on to my second and now third pregnancies, there was no way I could have done that at my local hospital at all. So to find another team who were willing to look after me, I was willing to travel however far I needed to travel to get the care I needed, my babies needed, you know, is amazing. And I would, you know, not have been able to do it had I had to go through. I mean, before I left, I didn't have an official debrief with them, but before I left hospital, the prematurity prevention consultant had said that we would just see what happened in my next pregnancy. And, you know, there was no plan as to whether we should have a bit of intervention or further monitoring or anything like that. And
it's all statistically done. And if we're truth speaking, after Freddie had died and we decided sort of 18 months later to go again, the only contact I had with Mark Johnson was because just before I gave birth to Fred, he came into the room where I was surrounded by consultants and it was all beeping and all lots going off. And I said to him, I think this is happening. And I was sort of almost keeping it quiet because I thought if I didn't tell anyone, no one will know that I'm still, you know, that my waters are still breaking. And he sat with me while I sort of sobbed and he just didn't leave, you know. And I always say this about Mark, he's the man that doesn't leave. And that was my only contact with him. And I thought 18 months later, how can I get him back?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I had no contact. No one would give, you know, no one's just, oh, can I have Mark Johnson's PA's number? It's just not going to happen. So I went in to the clinic. I had to tell a fib to the people at the desk at the Chelsea Westminster, and I went, actually, I'm under Mark Johnson. She went, are you? And I went, absolutely. Because I saw...
Whatever you've got to do.
Absolutely. I saw a different doctor there, and he said to me, you've just got to go away and forget you're pregnant. It won't happen again, don't worry about it. And I was like, no.
I don't know
this
how
isn't gonna, this is not going to wash for me.
That,
so I went to, and he went, oh, the doctor told me to ask for Mark Johnson's PA's details because that's my doctor now. She went, right, okay. And that is how I have my 20-year-old and 16-year-old. And certainly the eldest would not have survived without Mark Johnson. Not without it, not people say without science. I'm like, no, everyone else sent me away. And he said, no, you come in. Yeah. So it's an extraordinary thing. We do what we have to do.
Absolutely.
And you are now here with Natasha together, and she's under your care. Was this your vision for this service? Is this how it works? Is this how it works for everybody?
Yes, and I think, as much as you got out of that appointment, I got so much out of that. Because I think it's changed. It's really changed the way, it changed my practice in many ways, because, we see women coming in 23, 24 weeks, ruptured membranes. And when you listen to the stories of how the guilt as clinicians we've put on them when we said, well, you should end your pregnancy because you're going to get an infection. It's actually quite a huge thing for them, a decision. And the guilt that people carry away with them, and I think people need time to understand, because it's such a shock, as you said, when this is happening, because you didn't plan for your waters to go and for complications to happen. You plan to take home a term baby, because that's what we define as pregnancy, right? A term baby. And people go in with a complete shock, and then I think we bombard them with so much early information. We don't give them that space to accept, because it's going through like the process of grief, right? You're angry, then you've got to accept, and there is guilt, and it's that grief process when these things happen, and it's giving people that space. So I've learned from you and other women to give that space and to work and to understand what people are going through, because the experience is better. It's to try to limit the trauma that they experience. I think it's really, really important as clinicians. So I've learned a lot. Apart from the research side, I've learned a lot from that psychological impact, which I just wasn't aware.
But I think
the extent of it.
The very key difference, I would say, with you, Natasha, with Mark, and with his team and the people that I've met through Mark, is they listen. If we are not listening, if we are not digesting what is being said, how can things improve? I just wanted to thank you both. It's so incredible having you both here, actually, because it has linked in so beautifully. Natasha, what you're doing is obviously making more than a difference, not just scientifically speaking, but in real life circumstances.
Emotionally,
I know emotionally everything, and it all wraps in. And Lucy, that was incredibly kind of you and generous of you to share your story of Aussie.
Thank you for having me.
We are wishing you all the very best from everyone at Borne for your next little one. So thank you both. Thank you both so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Lucy.
Thank you.
So much.
For more information on the work of the Borne Foundation and how you can help the charity save babies' lives, please visit www.borne.org.uk or follow the links in the podcast notes. The Borne Podcast is presented by Ellie Gibson, Caro and Professor Mark Johnson. The music is by Kirsty Newton, and it is produced by Laura Grimshaw.